Is this recording? Yeah. Oh, great. Welcome back to our plenary session where what we'd like to do here is, first of all, have the audience, give the audience an opportunity to pose more questions, more discussion, pose one question to one speaker. We can have speakers respond to that question, or individual questions, group questions, however you want to do it. And before we start that, I'm going to have Mr. Paul respond to the last two questions that came up, very important questions that came up in his session. You can kick that off, and then we'll move to a general conversation. And when I spoke with Mr. Paul and Sanjay earlier, this is a moment for us to also think about strategic planning, collective goals, the local coalition that we have here in the Boston Study Group, but globally, what can we do? Some ideas to generate about building more forums like this, more events, symposia, and then how do we move beyond these local events to the dream that Mr. Paul mentioned, which is the UN Convention. So we got two parts to this. We're going to address the speakers on their talks, general conversation, but we want to use at least the last 25% of the time. Where do we go from here? What are the future directions? So I'll start with Mr. Paul in response to the last two questions, and then I can invite my speakers to also respond to Mr. Paul, and we can have a dialogue with the audience. So please, Mr. Paul.
I think it was Sampath.
Somnath.
Sorry.
Sampath is
Somnath.
Yes.
That's what I was wondering. How come I... So is Atrocities Act really effective? Now, I would put it as I would slightly relook at that question. For every drop of the hat of an issue, Indian government, like many other governments, would like to produce facades. Bonded labor is an issue, so bring out Bonded Labor Abolition Act. Really, minimum wages are not being given, and atrocious wages. If you look at the whole wage structure in India, it's reeks of caste system, and you have Minimum Wages Act. But atrocities, the violence, it's high time. In only 1989, they brought this act. But this facade has to be broken to say king has no clothes. Because in the name of democracy, they're bringing all this. And you're bringing them these in a so-called democratic way, and it's a typical fox and stork story, saying that you have all this, but the stork doesn't know how to do it because, first of all, you designed the system for inaccessibility. You have created a system without any resources for its implementation. You have resourced it with officers who have no team, whoever it is, and you have used that only for political vendetta, and really you have not used it for things. So these are all mechanisms, I feel. One, the facade of the mechanism, the starvation of budgetary allocations, the taking away any effective implementation because they have not provided any teeth in its effectiveness. So this is a play that you see. I think it's now an established manipulation that all governments everywhere do. So you need to challenge this, because if I don't do it, anarchy. Of course, anarchy also has its own value of disturbance, but you have to ensure that there is some kind of a democratic process to challenge this de-democratization process that is being done by the state. So therefore, we have used the Atrocities Act as a way of claiming Dalit rights. And I think maybe later Joel can share the kind of human rights report we try to produce, public hearings we do. We divided the whole thing into 7 steps, and then seeing how at the stage of registration of cases, at the stage of charge sheeting, act, everything expose the system and see how again discrimination is there, the conviction rate, the differences, and then take it to the there is a National Judicial Academy, And then finally, we struggled to push for amendments to the Act. And unfortunately, this is the problem with the Congress government. They gave the chance to the BJP government. The BJP government who had enacted the amendments. And the amendments. So what I'm really saying is, these are not supposed to be bringing any remedy, but we have to turn it around. Because if you don't do that, whatever you do as a challenging way, it becomes criminal act. So you have to turn it in a way to use it. And that's what also has brings me to Jaspreet's question. That inclusive thing is the same thing happens in the, we had several disasters, but one thing we have furnished is there was a huge tsunami that has taken place in 2004. And there we were able to investigate and see what are the levels of exclusion that has taken place in counting who are the affected, in immediate relief, rehabilitation, and in final compensations. So in all these places, there was an exclusion. So we engaged with the National Disaster Mitigation Authority to bring what is called exclusion. I think it's exclusion. Investigation of exclusions and inclusion monitoring reports. And there was a tool that was developed, and they're beginning to see if it can be monitored. So these are only tools. And similarly, we are looking at schools. We're looking at higher education. We're having a database of around 6,000 higher education scholars who have been systematically excluded from having access to higher education scholarships, both post-matric scholarships as well as Rajiv Gandhi. So where we want to do is, these systems which are not supposed to be working, put it on its head and make the communities own it and then demand till it becomes untenable. So therefore, allocations have to be increased, expenditures have to be done. So these are the things that we're trying.
Thank you, Paul. We can start with a few questions now. I have a question for my panelists in response to each other. How we want to proceed. Maybe one thing to get the group going is, can I ask each of the panelists to, start with Abda, respond in light of your presentation, including moments about the coming together coalition that you mentioned. How would you compare the context of slavery and taking a question back to us with what you heard in Mr. Paul's presentation and Ms. Magda's presentation? So, kind of reflection on the comparisons and contrasts.
I mean, the comparisons, you have some similarities and you have some differences. And the similarities are a lot to bring us together. And you, in Asia or within the Roma community, what you have is discrimination. And we can agree on the terms, I mean, on the concept to use. But wherever you are, it's unjust, it's something that is not just down to people. So how we just need to come up with the same concept and then move forward. And the differences is basically how you have some differences, not just similarities. Differences is maybe when it comes to approaches. One doesn't just need to belong to an oppressed organization to stand up for that organization. And even though those who are oppressed are the ones who know more about the oppression or the suffering of their people, but in Africa, we succeeded in knowing this is unjust down to other people, but everybody has to come together. However, we shouldn't just come together because we want to manipulate or we want to hijack their struggle. But we should come together because this is unfair, this is not loyal what is done to these people. So we should come together because we have to do things together. So similarities are what we are suffering from, and maybe the differences are just about strategies to use. But the strategy is determined by the milieu, by where you grow up, by what you study or where you are coming from. So in this moment, we will come together with different strategies that are used in different places and see how it should work. The last but not the least, so we have the momentum. So I mean, the time is favorable for us because of what happened in Libya. Everybody will listen. And when Paul is talking about Dalits in let's say in Asia, people will listen because it's similar what happened to Africans in Libya. So and that is why to go forward, I think we should have a strategic plan, a 2-year strategic plan from now on, and see what need to be done to the next 3 months, 6 months, and then a year, and then move forward. Because, like I said before, we shouldn't jump into the coming generation. We should solve this problem and move on.
Thank you. And Ms. Magda, in response to what Abner said, the EU context, maybe the Commission on Human Rights, the comparisons and contrasts, and sort of set up the possibility of moving to, back to Mr. Paul, the last slide that we couldn't show, the dream of that future convention. What does that look like university? So we'll start with the Roma experience, predominantly in the European context. What are the comparisons?
So there are a few points that I would like to make. First of all, I do believe that the mechanisms of oppression are very similar in different contexts and geographies. And listening to your stories, it's clear that violence, inequality in access to education, inequality in access to health, discrimination, they are all happening, although they may take a different form. But I do believe that the actual test for many of us activists working in a certain field is to prove that when we see a human rights violation that is not targeting our group but is targeting another group, we do react to that and we do care about it. And I think to some extent it happens. And watching the CNN report on Libya, I could not stop, but thinking what could we do, and perhaps that's because I come from a community with a history in slavery, so I could find myself into that. But on the other hand, I've been in activism back in Europe for quite a while to know that not all Roma activists would be willing to talk about the LGBTQ issues and to create coalitions with them. Not many of them would be interested to cooperate with feminist organizations and other groups. So what I'm saying is that I do believe that it's a challenge that we have to take into account. And perhaps Professor West would say here that the issue is not our own community, but it's rather an issue of humanity and how you perceive all the others and how you help the others to be part of a global community. And I think that this is somehow part of the reason why I really want to learn first from your communities and at the same time try to build coalition, because I think building coalition can seem interesting and it is fascinating, but there is a level of understanding and nuance and detail that you really need to know in order to move forward a common agenda. And I think that's the role of all these small meetings that we have, and I'm really, really grateful for the work of the Boston Study Group, because very often you bring us together and every day, we learn how to cooperate better. So in terms of the European context, it's if we were to put it in parallel with the American context, yes, the Roma are perceived as dangerous, as criminals, as inferior, and so are the African Americans in the US, and so are the Dalits in India. So the oppression is there, and we've seen that in the European context, for instance, we have one of the most progressive legal tools in the world, and that's the European Court of Human Rights. Does it really function? Well, it functions for individuals. So you have cases that are brought in front of the court and the individuals get remedies, but what happens with the mass violation of human rights? How do you tackle collective issues? So if one kid who go into a segregated school gets remedies, what happens with the millions of others who are in exactly the same situation, but they are not the target of strategic litigation that NGOs are doing. So I think that's a concern and perhaps a challenge that we have in terms of existing human rights mechanisms, and much more at the level of the UN. I think we really need to rethink and reshape these mechanisms.
Wonderful. Thank you, Magda. That's a really excellent point about individual rights as opposed to collective or group rights, or structurally based as opposed to the individual rights. It's like intentional discrimination versus structural white supremacy, for example, in the United States. Mr. Paul, in light of both of those, you concluded with this: how do we actualize the UN Convention? It hasn't emerged yet on work and dissent, commonalities of discrimination and violence, but we have to think about that moral consensus that we have to build, while respecting boundaries, limits, and local norms. Because in some respects, the global caste phenomenon that originated in South Asia, may not directly speak to the nature of oppression in different contexts for different groups. So where were you heading if you would have had more time in the conclusion of the presentation? Where is that UN Convention? What's it look like?
Before I get to that point, let me just look at the whole question of similarities. If you look at just the state that I come from, of course now it's two states, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. And if you take any two Dalits, now there will be so many differences even among the two Dalits. They all are both the scheduled castes, because now they're even rejecting the term Dalits because they're saying, hey, we don't want to accept Dalits because you are the ones who have actually oppressed me. And so the fight is not against other forces. Fight is actually turning against Mahas, against Malas, against Chamas. And this is one side. And on the other side, and slightly different, if you look at just the Indian context, there is nothing that is really similar between Khatiks. Sorry, I'm using the words which you may not. It's a community which some of them believe it's above the line of touchability, but they are called scheduled castes, and therefore they are that. And then you look at Valmiki communities or Madhya communities, and they are saying we are the real Dalits. So there is one way looking at it: Roma, Dalit, Haratim, and Kilambo, Burakumin. If you put it, there is nothing. But what is common? The systems that privilege this kind of dissent and discrimination are going rampant. Now, I think you very well articulated. I would like you to actually say that in a little slower, a little unpack it. I think you did it in just about 3.5, maybe 1.5 minutes or something. I think you must really unpack that, because the paradigm that has happened is looking at Eurocentric human rights from the one perspective, and have not looked at systems which have so-called discriminated our own. And then these are things which the so-called indigenous systems, systems which have very powerful thing globally, but then first you tell it, okay, this caste system belongs to, it's a very ethnic issue, and we don't want to say anything that upsets the Indians. We don't want to upset anything with the Africans. So now I come to UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is going to, I think, rule the entire governments in the next 10 years of how the aid and how the fund flow is going to take place. Not a word of Haratim, not a word of Roma, not a word of Dalits. They have conveniently, the years of struggles that these communities, in the form of race and other things have come, all have been shunned aside. Nothing. So there is a repeating attempt to invisibilize, trivialize, and therefore say, no, the real thing is, but you use the word, the nomenclature is so much hijacked. Leave no one behind. Keep the last one first. But in all these, you look at all the Indians there, you look at all the Africans, you look at all the Europeans, not a single Roma, not a single Dalit, maybe if you here and there, not a single person who talks about this. Why are we letting this kind of an exclusion continue? So I feel I'm not propagating that this is an answer to the panacea of Dalits or Roma or Haratim or similarly discriminated people across. We need all the strategies that are available to expose, to challenge, and democratize it. So, on the development side, on the human rights side, on the political representation side, on the domestic side, what are the multi-level strategies that we need to do with what you have slightly, I think, very sharply, very clearly summarized? There is a new paradigm that needs to expose these. Sampath, I think, I don't know whether to call it a conspiracy because we don't have any lack of depth of academic scholarship in India or any of these countries. As Abda has been very clearly, and even Magda, who have been saying, there are so much of researchers who are human rights activists who have been talking about it, but they have not framed. So, race question to some extent I think has managed to capture today what Dalit lives matter and the people to power, that kind of a thing is possible because you have got that kind of a framework. You have managed to articulate it, managed to rephrase it. I think many of us have contained this only among India, and you don't want to go outside of India. Even to go to Nepal or Pakistan, or maximum we'll go to Nepal, but we will not go to Bangladesh or Pakistan. Leave alone, we will not look for bonds between Roma and other communities. I feel, again, this is not a panacea, but is it possible so that there are umpteen invisibilized communities in many other nations who are exactly going through these forms of violations in their own countries, but they don't have language. And because we didn't have language till now, the Dalit issue could not be challenged in the UN, and we had to call it as either as a gender rights or as a human rights issue or as something, but it doesn't capture the essence of what Magda is going through, what Abda has been saying. So I'm saying, is it possible for us to look at it? One strategy, and it's also tactical because they have the language, and they have this language of leave no one behind. If you look at the indicators, the target and indicators in the entire UN Sustainable Development Goals, fantastic. I mean, you would really want to see that those targets and indicators respond to us, but they talk about that and they don't involve us because we have not articulated it and pitched our right there. I think this is only one attempt, a small attempt, which we need to pitch and weave some of these so that when anybody talks about human rights, they also mean Roma rights. They also mean Haratim rights. They also mean that. When anybody talks about sustainable development goals, is this really able to remove hunger among Roma? Hunger. When they talk about resilient societies or resilient communities, is the next high-level political forum's theme. And can we say, where is the damn resilience when here most of these communities are being destabilized, their vulnerability is to such extreme that it has not taken into any agenda of the countries. Now, this challenge we are not able to do primarily because we don't have leverage. So this is one way of increasing our leverage.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. I want to, in response to Mr. Paul, I want to pose a question to the audience and introduce a principle from critical race theory. Because what you're saying, Mr. Paul, is if you look at the historical narrative from colonialism to the present, the white male majority that had most of the historical power for the last 500 years, from that system of domination of non-Western and non-white peoples, and then the patriarchal domination of all women around the world, and eventually sexual minorities, individual rights in a colorblind way, based on this standard, became the bedrock of the liberal democracies that were born. It took, after the democracies were born, slavery in America, untouchability throughout Indian history, but from decolonization and intentional liberation, established, the birth of the Indian Constitution. It then emerged that this notion of group oppressions and group rights and identities can take on this question of colorblind individual rights. That is the Black Civil Rights Movement. That is the struggle of adults since Ambedkar was president. But now, as Mr. Paul is saying, the fear is that we're moving to this disaggregation between the individual white male rights to the group rights of oppression trying to assert themselves, a new phenomenon. Now as we think about the future and how we should resist that, what is this new phenomenon? It's now disaggregation of whiteness. It's disaggregation of minority groups back to these primordial nationalistic identities. Let me give you an example. In 2020, there is speculation that the US Census will change. Right now, we have actually an iteration. It used to be white and minorities. Then it became Latino, Hispanic, Latinos, non-Latino, Hispanic, people of Spanish-speaking descent from Latin America. So non-Latino, Hispanic, and Latino, Hispanic. And then you can put the racial markers, Black, Asian, white, etc. If they do away with this, and we have to think about this in the post-9/11 framework, we have to think about this in the fear of the global diversity when new groups are trying to assert rights through multilaterals or through their national democracies. There is a new fear emerging from those that have the power. So how do they reclaim the power and the privilege? Disaggregate whiteness. White is no longer just whiteness, whatever that is, and non-Latino Hispanic people of European descent. It is specifically that because North African and Middle Eastern peoples, although they get to count because of Arabic and Semitic roots as whiteness, they will become a separate group. Asian Americans, we're a lump together. Anything from Pakistan all the way to the east, one group can now become Indian American, Nepali American, Chinese American, Cambodian American. And you think, okay, well, there's a breakdown of these large group structures. It's splintered into these micro-identities. But critical race theorists will tell you this is based on some kind of convergence interest. Some policymaker, which you've alluded to very astutely, Mr. Paul, some set of policymakers, at least in the democratic government of the United States, and then you can map that to what the multilateral institutions are doing, think it's beneficial for smaller groups to self-identify. But as minorities, they're not going to capture the elite power. And as you're saying, Mr. Paul, it's not, and as Magda said, and Abdul said, it's not just a question of focusing on the individual atrocity and the individual remedy and the individual policy to address one incident. This can lead to another structural form of pitting the groups against each other. While some groups that already contain capital, power, interest, government, plan the peaceful coexistence of different groups. So in other words, we're moving into a future where individual rights that began in the West, the group rights of the 20th century to fight for civil rights, Dalit and Black, for example, is now we're moving to a third category, which is neither individual or group, but the fragmentation by color and race into micro-national identities within large, diverse liberal democracies, whether it's the European context or the United States. So my question to the group is, as you think about your questions, what are your thoughts about this notion of the future convention? Can we, in this inspiration, Mr. Paul, look for words beyond work, dissent, hereditary dissent? What is the glue that we have to think about to bind what you've heard from three different contexts? Four, if you have the Black American experience. Four different contexts of oppression. What are some of the comparisons and contrasts you have in your own mind, in your own work? How do we begin to think about the coalition? That's the thing. So if we can get some questions in that vein for our panelists, we can move to the next phase. So who can I? Bernard, please.
Yeah, just thank you very much. I listened and actually I benefited a lot. Just to responding the question that you put and some of my concern, just to come to the point, and just how we should be able to reorient the power, supremacy, and the privilege historical that exist, and we should be able to reorient. Another thing is that I agree with the heterogeneity, and through employing the intersectionality approach, and we should be able to true disadvantage. Not repeating the same mistake that we did previously, kind of the elite capturing of the resources and power. And we should be able to just propose the rainbow approach. And actually we can see all the colors, not undermining and distorting true substantive issues of each and every group, but it looks like some sort of a coalitions collectively. Thank you.
So I'll start with Ms. Magna, I'll move to Mr. Agna, and we'll come back to Mr. Paul. So if you can start with Ms. Magna.
First, I would say that it's not just white supremacy, because in some contexts, like the American one, white supremacy is a fact. In other contexts, for instance, as in India, that's not exactly the problem. The problem, I think, it's called something else. It goes perhaps the same for the Roma in Europe, although talking about whiteness and white supremacy in Europe, it doesn't really make sense because we don't really develop so much this idea of race, and we don't talk about whites and blacks and Latinos, but rather, about minority groups and so on. So we have a different mindset on that topic, although I think the commonality of all these terminologies and all these concepts is really the fact that there are those who are in power who would always oppress those who belong to a minority. And we can call them in different ways, but I think the mechanism, again, remains the same.
Thank you. Mr. Abna?
So you see them more as a class than as a race.
No, I don't think it's a class issue. I'm just saying that the context really matters, and I think that if you talk in the Dalit context about whiteness, no, it doesn't really put the finger on the actual problem, because the problem in India is not between whites and blacks. It's more about people coming from,
I guess but the dialectic I was suggesting is that, to compare with Mr. Paul, is that individual rights to group rights in the 20th century's resistance to this new category where subdivisions were being created, even within the peoples of the struggle. So he said within the Dalit community, it's starting to splinter. Please don't call me this, I'm this group. So the analog is that in our Western democracy, because it's a racial issue, that's the core problem, is that there's going to be a disaggregation now of the major blocks of identity. So I want to compare the Dalit caste experience of how within the Dalit community there's a fragmentation with what's going to happen to the ethno-diversity that will take place in this country because of the diminishing demographic power of the whites, even though they capture state wealth. And so to turn to Mr. Abda, instead of thinking about rights in terms of race or caste, and in the case of the Roma, which is neither one, quite frankly, as you're saying, whether it's the European context, it doesn't see things in such a racial manner, but in terms of national identity and culture and homogeneity and legacy of the history, and French means French means French-speaking language, French rights, the la cité, secular structure, without looking into the fact that there's massive oppression of racial minorities, African people, African descent, Muslims, within Western European democracy. You see that today. So I guess the question is, that basic humanity you were driving towards at the very end, maybe the categories can't apply across contexts, race, caste, etc. But we are talking about the legacy of the mentality that some people can be owned and abused and neglected, while the world stands indifferent to the phenomenon. That's the issue. I think it's driving Mr. Paul's piece about the next basis for the convention. So if we can address this issue, where were you going towards the end there? If you had more, you said conclusions.
Yes.
What was the last, some of the other conclusions?
I mean, before responding, I would just make a quick comment about the notion, I mean the concept of race. My fellow white Mauritanians realized they were not whites when they came to the United States. And when they were filling those applications, they said they are white. They said, no, they are not white.
It's already happened in 2020, but North African and Middle Eastern, they've been included in white for
So
now.
they call themselves white when they are in Mauritania, and once they are in the US, they realize they are not white. I know it's matter of color, of origins, but let's try to move forward the fact of it's also a problem of justice. or injustice being done to a group of people. So let's try at least to address it as a matter of injustice being done to a group of people. If we all agreed what happened to Dalits are injustice, and it's how we can also have other people coming toward our platform. We recognize it's basically they are suffering. I don't have doubt because of some people are suffering in Africa because of the color of their skin. Some people are suffering because of their ethnicity. So it's an injustice. So when we try to label it as injustice being done to these people because of their origin or because of their ethnical group, we can move forward. But if we say it's just racism, at that time we will have a hard time to say what is race, to define what is race or to define what is ethnicity, because it's become very, very difficult. So I will go with basically not a matter of class, but just injustice being done to a large group of people because of their origins or because of their, of their ethnicities. So I would put injustice and fighting against injustice will bring a lot of those people who we don't know. They may be, suffering from other countries. Will bring them together and will make them be very sympathetic to what we are doing.
Thank you. In light of what Magda was saying about justice, maybe diminishing the racial context, we can't just use the United States as although it thinks it's been a history of progressive legislation for different groups over a long period of history. Leaving aside maybe some of these discrete variables, we're thinking about caste justice. In light of what you were saying about democracy, and then the concept of the state in this Indian democracy, and then the Dalit movements, quite frankly, the diaspora, the bill in the parliament for the UK, the DC meeting that we just recently had on convincing the US Congress that something like discrimination on the basis of caste occurs here, and that we need to find the principles that are not in our constitutional law because they are about black and white and desegregation and the civil rights movement. We need another type of legislative mindset, principles of justice, to deal with really the depths of the problem. Because the problem is not going away. And it's unfortunate we're living through this period of Indian nationalism and the right wing, which is only intensifying the problem. But long prior to the BJP, it's a structural matter that Ambedkar knew. So caste justice, what does that mean to you nationally, multilaterally?
I mean, as Magda and Abdarahman was talking, I was really wondering, I think one of the issues for us is the slipperiness of what makes anything which is unjust. Why I say the slipperiness is, if you look at, I do not know if anybody, you must have seen Oxfam's report of global inequality, right? Have anybody looked at that? Please, it's a fantastic report. It talks about how in Latin America, just 10 individuals who dominate more than 50% of the wealth in the entire Latin, something like that, and then the whole day. But they don't talk a single word about Indian report also of Oxfam's inequality does not talk about caste. Now, no doubt what they have said is true. Everything is true, and I sympathize with them. But it does not capture the 260, or not, it's about 201 million Dalits who have different forms of exclusion that they are facing. Leave no one behind in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So passionately talk about it. But then the grip when it comes to the communities who are literally continuously being left behind are not being addressed. So it's a politics. I think it is not accidental. This is the first I was thinking. It's not accidental because the entire semantics has also have been sanitized by the so-called democracy and using all the best words of democracy, but using all possible means to not conclude to have any specific impact on these communities. So my problem is that. My problem is we are using so much of these words and all this, and then when it comes to Africa, you miss out the entire communities like Harare. You miss out these 260 million people, not by accident, but by design. Now, what is that language or an architecture, a norm architecture that you can build, which can capture these? And I'm sure after about 2-3 decades, that will again be captured. But so be it. It's okay because we are in this. Everything is going to be captured. Class in about say 500 years ago, class meant not the class but caste. But today, class does not mean caste at all. Right? That doesn't mean race in some countries, like say, would mean this, but it doesn't talk about some of these issues. So now you have this list that Office of the High Commission says that color, race, religion, ethnicity, gender. Of course, they are not able to say LGBTQI sexuality, but I think he has Hussein, the High Commissioner, has word sexuality has used, but it has not sufficient. Caste only doesn't capture this. So therefore, my first thing is, can we have a handle on this by trying to identify these systems? One is identify the systems as well as the impact of the systems on some of these communities, and slowly begin together. Maybe after 40 years, 50 years, it will be redundant, but doesn't matter. I mean, doesn't matter means we'll try to see that it makes a difference, but there are the multiple intersectionalities of how in India no more can Paul Divakar go and say Dalit women will come and just kill me on the street, saying that you fellow, you're not even talking about Dalit women. Now Dalit sexuality, there's so many things are coming. So you need these an architecture which can, what you are saying, deconstruct the kind of domination of a particular Eurocentric, or call it, it's not just Eurocentric, I think it's Brahminical centric, it is I don't know what this centric is, all these centrics have come together, deconstruct that and bring together in a way that the centrality, when you mean this name, like how I'm fascinated by the word indigenous because maybe grass on the other side is greener, but to me, how in one word they are able to see, whenever indigenous is told to me, I can think of, okay, they have been displaced, they demand their right to self-determination, they demand right to land, they demand right to dignity, all that. No, we don't have that architecture, that word, which can bring us into one. Can we bring this together? It's a politically driven term. I think even Dalit is a politically driven term. That has nothing to do with anthropology, nothing to do with sociology, nothing. It's a word. I don't know. There is who has used it? Not Ambedkar. Maybe Ambedkar also used it, but they say.
Used it for the Fuller used it for the
Fuller used it. I don't think okay, but let us ascribe it to Baba Sahib Ambedkar because then we can say safely Jai Bhim, it's there. But no, it's a political ideology that he has brought in, bringing the people together, even though there are these differences. So can we do that so that we can exercise our and so when you talk about it, then you will say, hey, don't forget Romas when you talk about it. Don't forget Harate, and of course we'll have to say Roma, not men alone. It has to be Roma women, Roma youth. Dalit, definitely not men alone. So that can be built into this thing. That is the way I feel. But then the other question that you've asked is, what does this convention contain? I think that's another stream that we'll have to look at it. I think there Magda, if I may say so, has very nicely put. There are challenges this current convention has in terms of several gaps. By its very design, it doesn't allow the other view of participation, of being accountable So how do we bring in those aspects? Does it only look about state? Because most of us, it is not the design of state versus non-state. It is also cultural. So it is one person and one community against another community, and state mediates this power. So can we bring in a third force, which is state and this focus community and the non-state actors also into this? So therefore, how do we build this? I think that convention, the substance of it, I think is another major initiation that we need to do. The other one is, how do we term ourselves? First of all, should I invest time into building this? Will it have any better traction? That's another thing which both Magda and Abda also has raised. Will it have? What is the use of this if it doesn't have domestic traction? If it doesn't impact on the community? So how do we build this is another course that we need.
I think a good summary, I mean, I've heard so much now from our three speakers, and with your last statement, Paul. Classism and all the socialist discourses during the Cold War, Eastern socialism and the Western socialist parties, and the history of socialism in India, for example. Classism, as Ambedkar diagnosed, the great Indian card, that doesn't capture it. As beautiful and as much we want to empower the indigenous movements, reclaiming dignity, reclaiming pre-colonial identities that are not Judeo-Christian, sustainability in nature, the land, naming, semi-autonomy and sovereignty. You know, there's great stakes for the indigenous peoples around the world that are really going to have to face the drama of climate change. But that doesn't capture, the indigeneity name doesn't capture. We know the individual rights that I spoke about that form the Western democratic constitution from which India and other South Asian democracies eventually drew doesn't capture this dynamic. So as we move towards that, what is the centrics that you mentioned? How do they coalesce? Well, let's see what they have in common. We've talked about that. It is the capture of state, power, capital, media, higher education, and the determination of policies that shape our just public institutions. Certain groups, radical supremacy. People don't realize in terms of the inequality you spoke about. U.S. 550 billionaires. Now that China's risen over the last 20 years, they're number two. Can you imagine? In just 20 years, number two in the number of billionaires out of a population of 1.3. Guess who just passed up the Russians, who have 180 million people in their population? The Indians. 90 guys, how many billion? Passing up China? 3? 2? Okay, U.S. GDP is 17 trillion. China will pass it eventually, 10 trillion. Yeah, India, now top 10, more than individually the Western countries, Britain, France, Israel. They'll drop out. There's Brazil, India, South Africa. But India really, it could be with its growth rates. But you have 90 guys controlling the future third, maybe, largest GDP. When you have 1.3 billion people, it's different from having 20 trillion, and the white and or a few minoritized populations capturing American capital, over 300 million people, of which blacks suffer the most. So the centricity here, with grammatical supremacy controlling all the institutions, or upper caste plus grammatical, and or white and or overrepresented privileged groups right now, quite frankly, Indian Americans and Chinese Americans. The very same Indian Americans of the high caste who set up the South Asian departments that refuse to talk about caste, by design, as you said. So the question is, the nature of supremacy, whether it's racial or class, or the exclusion within the exclusion, which is the complexity of the Roma. Roma's origin is unknown. I mean, we pointed to North India, but you're not allowed to recapture that. There is no question of political and civil rights of a people that are permanently brutalized. And to Abda, I have to say, the new conception of slavery, a new dialectic, another conception that doesn't fit anything we've seen. Antiquity, in which it was the basis of economies, the master-slave, the feudalistic structure in the West, which is limited freedom within essential space, that's segregation back then for whites, but then it became people of color in the United States, Roma in the European context, to now this alleged notion that basic rights just mean subsistence, security, and liberty. The new form of slavery is the centricity of peoples, the power of the state, the benign quality of democracy to literally kill people at will with impunity, or to bully them to death, or to enslave their labor onto death, or to continuously marginalize. This is mob mentality, condoned by the state. The Jim Crow was the white mob of which the state was apathetic, white citizens acting with impunity to harm, bully, harass, and kill black people. That function has been taken over by the state. The caste context, that's what we were brought here for, and reaching out to other groups, the coalition. The caste context in the 21st century doesn't fall into any of these categories. And yet it continues. You're telling me it's intensifying. There are now more people at 210 million than there were probably 50 years ago? Okay. Not to mention idealized tribals, the gentleman who brought that up. So my question again to the panel and to the group here is, slavery today has to mean physical control of human bodies by the state, and the death penalty that they risk on a daily basis. Walking down the street, the cop car comes, crossing into another village, forget about intercaste marriage as the solution to dissolve all caste problems. That hasn't happened yet. And quite frankly, interracialization in this country, which is roughly about 10%, and maybe further along in terms of if you compare that context with intercaste, but that doesn't seem to be the solution. So I want to pose this back to the group. We have to think about centricity and a new modality of domination in which the people that have suffered the most stand the risk of absolutely no protections, and that's why individual and civil rights can't help you. The diversity within the dollar movement can't create class consciousness. State representation, you were asking about that just briefly, from the local to the federal, is tokenization. So we go back to Ambedkar, I'd argue, and what he was asking for. Those of you that read the Buddha and the Marx, the last essay before he died, before the mass conversion, go back to that little piece. He lays out the principles of Buddhism as he left Hinduism. What he found in the contradictions of Marxism at the end, such a brilliant guy in the 1950s, not just reflecting back on the Russian Revolution, but what he talked about is the inability to form a state that doesn't become fascistic in the socialist revolution, because new groups will capture the power to distribute the wealth. So he had some problems at the end with this pure Marxist notion. And he was right. There is no Marxism. It's the complete opposite. So a new conception of slavery that can also meet a new theory of the state that is building a new form of fascism and authoritarianism. I can point to this country, Trump and white nationalism. But take it to the three different contexts. Slavery is itself not a political economic control of individual labor. It's the ability of the state to kill at will those peoples that have never had any dignity. And I think that becomes the basis of the Declaration of the Manifesto. That's how we do it. I put it all out there. We have about 15 more minutes. I want to welcome at least a couple more perspectives. Any kind of reflections on anything you've heard today, anything you want to ask the speaker. There's no pre-prepared idea in your mind. It could be anything that you're trying to find. But I'd like to get the audience engaged. Jeffrey, please.
You go. Yeah. It's fine. So I know we talked a little bit, Magda, I think you said about minority, like shifting the focus of minority as a problem to majority as the target. And this comes up in many conversations with different discriminated groups, that it's considered as the problem of the group, and there are like many issues, with internal issues that we talked about, hierarchy within the Dalit community, hierarchy within the Black community, but there is definitely like a fighting out, and shifting the focus from marginalized, like putting the focus on the group to do something about it, rather than focusing on the oppressor to do something about it. So, like, how do you imagine that in all of these different contexts? And so, like, translating it into a very simple like question, it would be basically like, how do you say that somebody becomes a better ally, better accomplice? How would you put that out?
She's writing down the question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm also thinking about a possible answer to this question, and I think I'm not a strong believer in either or paradigms, and I'm sorry if I put it that way in my presentation because I think it's a little bit more nuanced than just shifting the target from the minority on the majority in terms of what needs to be done. And there are different layers of these two problems. But I think that somehow the reason why I'm saying that is, for instance, because in some of the European policies that we have in our context on the Roma issues, you would often see the institutions paying money and training mediators to work with schools. And these mediators, according to these policies, are meant to work with Roma families and bring their children to school. And in my experience, I think it's interesting and in some context really works because some of the Roma families would not have birth certificates for their children or there are other limitations, so it can help. But the actual question that I have is why do you have to train all these people that work in mixed communities and not have them working with the non-Roma families who send their children to school and these children bully their Roma children and make them drop out from school, and parents who protest against Roma being in the same classroom with the Roma. So what I'm saying is that we just create this idea of a minority group as a problem. And to a certain extent, I think if I were to put a criticism on the Roma movement so far, I think in the past 27 years or so, we really have fallen into this trap of thinking that we are the problem. And honestly, we've contributed a lot to these all these policies on let's include the Roma, let's integrate the Roma, let's send them to school, let's do campaigns for them and all that. And you look now back and you think that, well, it works, they go to school, but what kind of schools? And how well are they integrated into those schools? And I think it doesn't work one way. So whatever you do on the side of the minority, if the majority doesn't do anything, then there is no progress. And I think this is where the frustration, but also my whole reasoning is let's talk frankly about the oppressor, because this is where the problem starts. If you talk to any intellectual in Europe, and I think also in your context as well, about the Roma education, they all want to talk about it. They want to send them to school, they want to help them money with anything.
And school, only primary school.
Yeah, primary
they will not
school,
talk about higher education.
exactly. But then when you start talking about discrimination and white privilege, in our case Gajo privilege, in your case it would be like Brahmin privilege, and so on, then when you start talking about that, you become the enemy. So yeah, speaking about allies, I think we've learned that at least our movement, the Roma movement, has learned quite a bit from other struggles, and it's very clear to us that it's not possible to move on unless you have allies, and it's often very fortunate when you have allies who are in power. So whenever you have that opportunity, you take it and you use it to the maximum. But why do we have to wait for a small opportunity and for luck to get what we need to get and what we have the right to get?
When I hear Magda, I hear about the paradox is that if you fight for human rights, you have to assume being a human being, as I would say. I think we came upon a principle that binds the two experiences. Colonialism conquered non-Western civilizations, but prior to their arrival, there was no understanding of the hidden domination built into Indian civilization through Hinduism. Primordial blackness vis-a-vis white supremacy, it's the power of the white to define that which is not, namely black, as the inhuman. So one principle is that in reclaiming the right, if you're black, there is no origin. It's the origin of the human species in Africa. But from the civilizational perspective from colonization, there's no retracing. Fanon talked about this. Roma's origins too, the right to reclaim, the indigenous can reclaim the origins and assert it. But when you don't have an origin, and think about the sheer horror, the haunted house or horror house that the castle that Ambedkar speaks, you're stuck there and there's no stairwell to go up or down. Nobody knows the origins of Hinduism. It's all mythic, ideological fascism from the Brahmins, painting this notion of a civilization that has some roots, but it was born on the basis of oppression of a people. So in not being able to trace the origin, trying to overcome the fact that the dominant powers categorize something as inhuman. The only way you can categorize, justify domination of mankind, slavery to casteism, to the persecution, the state persecution as an experiment of the Roman, is by first imagining this inhuman that exists. The untouchable, the impure. Black is demonic. Roma doesn't fit either of the categories as we showed. So you don't have an origin. You have to overcome the label of the inhuman. That was primordial because it gave birth to the notion of supremacy, the centrics. That has to be in the Declaration. Undoing the inhuman characterization that perpetuates the apathy that allows what you're talking about, the injustice of it. So I want to put that out here. Maybe one more question as we wrap up, and then I'll have just a brief concluding remarks from all three. Please.
Yeah, so you know how we heard and we talked about this coming together of Roma movements, Dalit movements, and other things, or trying to find how we can come together. Again, I'll frame my question in the context of India because I don't have knowledge much outside of that. Is how do we talk about a similar framing between other marginalized groups within India? So we, Dalits building bridges with Muslims, with Adivasis, and such, and also along with that, if you all three of you maybe could comment on how you see the changing nature of the state itself, if you at all see that there has been a dramatic shift in the nature of the state. Not to say that the oppressed were always oppressed, regardless of what kind of state it was. But if you think the state is turning even more wildly vicious and bearing its fangs much more shamelessly than it used to, and what effect that is having on the movements of the oppressed.
Let's take the second half of the question. What I'd like to do is start with Abner, Magda, and then we'll close with Mr. Paul. So take the second half of the question, and if you can also, I'm just thinking at the time because we have a couple more announcements, but make that your concluding reflections as well. So we'll start with Abner, then we'll go to Mr. Paul. Response to the second half of the question on the state, or any portion of it, and combine that with your reflections.
Well, at this time it's very difficult to say this is going to be the conclusion because it's a thinking process. But what I'm learning from here is basically the response to our questions are not just political. It's good. It's not just a political will. So when we have to write a declaration, we need also to have knowledge. And knowledge is basically, when I go from her experience, knowledge is coming from people who are oppressed, who knows their community better than anybody. So whatever we have to do in the process of seeking for peace or seeking for justice, the communities that are oppressed, the leader of those communities has to be part of the process in order to find solutions that are definitive and will be the best solution. Otherwise, what's going to happen is they will say, well, maybe Harakians need to be free, and they will outlaw it 4 times without talking to Harakians. And they will say maybe Roman need schools without knowing the real problem. So whatever in our manifesto, whatever we have to in our declaration, we need to state somewhere that the people, the oppressed people, people who are victim of the injustice, has to come and give their opinion in the process of seeking peace. Not just the oppressor being there and trying to find a solution. That solution will be political, but it's not gonna reflect like the background, the cultural background of the issue.
Thank you.
Sorry, you're the second one. So, a few more points again. One that I would underline is that I do believe that the international human rights framework has had a contribution in the past 69 years on improving the human rights situation in the world, and especially in transitional countries, transitional to democracies. So I do give the UN that. I think it's important to acknowledge also some of the progress. What we've learned though is that we cannot take things for granted. If you would have asked me 10 years ago if I would ever see a fascist or a neo-Nazi talking about, killing Roma again, I would say perhaps not, is unacceptable. It happens on a regular basis now. And that point really brings me to the idea of how we look at the state and how it functions. Now, when we criticize the system, do we criticize democracy or do we criticize neoliberalism? And very often we fall into that trap when young people in surveys would say we do not agree with how the system looks like now. And some researchers will say, well, they don't like democracy, they like something else. But what if it's not democracy? And what if they talk more about capitalism, neoliberalism? And how would actually democracy look like 10 years from now? Do we want to challenge the system? And I think we do need to imagine a little bit more courageous how minorities of all kinds should be included and should have access to justice. And finally, a point that I think will be a little bit more challenging for a further discussion, Paul, and I do hope we continue this conversation, is how do we imagine this new convention, knowing that there are so many limitations in the other conventions that have been approved so far, and knowing that it's the states who actually agree on those and who manage and control those conventions. Would it really help the Dalits and the Roma and other groups to advance, or is another mechanism of control of our communities?
Really challenging, and I think what you asked also is a question that will have to be answered from my Indian perspective, also by Dalits, not just by Dalits. It's solidarity, but that is parallel. So the real horror of the demonification that is taking place, and it has to be all concerned citizens of this country, whatever kind of background that you come from. I think it's really important step. But having my experiences on how I have been part of the aggregate, and in being part of the aggregate, my issues have been marginalized, like human rights. It doesn't concern my rights. Anti-communalism doesn't concern the issues of the Dalit Muslims who are being the whole gender movement does not sufficiently talk about the Dalit women. So, while doing that, the other parallels that I need to work towards is, because I cannot only, there is work that needs to be done in country, there is no doubt about it, that we need to do. But one other additional support that we need to have is this coming from all angles. And I feel tactically, this is one angle which is not sufficiently moved. And I think it can give traction to us. And I want to play that. I think many of us who are in positions of conceptualizing, like many of you who are here, symbolized by like Sampath, who are able to question the hegemony of the nature of supremacy. And what I've said, the nature of supremacy is defined, and while talking about it, they will highlight all these antiquities and what you're calling it primordial times, and will not address the issue. They will talk about this nature of supremacy, but will perpetuate the systems that are continuing currently today. They will talk about all this, but while willfully neglecting and negating any right of Roma, any right of Dalits, any right of these things there. And they will talk about all this and then say, hey, my friend, Divakar, this is not the body, this is third. And please don't confuse issues. No, this is racism conference. And they have banned us from making any rights to institutions which cause racism like. So therefore, this nature of a new form of supremacy which talks about deconstructing supremacy but actually building another forms of supremacy, we have to have language. Mine is only a very small, what we are about is only a very small. I completely agree with Margarita's thing that, okay, we really need to look at the substance. We don't want to buy into something which will again perpetuate the same kind of limitations that the other UN mechanisms that have negated us. I fully agree. We have to do. But that does not mean that I will put up with these forms and the language which has been totally hijacked by being democracy, but continues to perpetuate and invisibilize us and our concerns and our rights. So therefore, we need to also, unfortunately, the only thing available is next time, this is maybe a two-dimensional democracy, maybe you will have a 3 or 4-dimensional democracy that comes, not just state and citizens, maybe state, corporates. I think already we are into 3-dimensional things. So we need a multi-dimensional democracy where I get a seat also because of my historical forms of discrimination. And that makes gives my agency the strength to my voice, and therefore we are using this only as a tool, as yet another tool that gives attraction. That does not negate the struggles against Trump, the struggles against Modi. That does not negate our joining our hands with the LGBTI community, and the whole sexual orientation and the kind. Of course, we definitely need to do. I'm not saying only to be politically right. There's a very, very critical issues, but this issue also needs to be given a voice, and I think it's time that we articulate it. I think we need some friends who can really sew up a new language so that this damn democracy and the kind of hegemonizing a different world which defines. They have hijacked my words. They have hijacked our demands for human rights, and they've used totally again to work against us. I think we need to beat this game, and I think we can do it.
Please give a round of applause for our speakers. I'd like to call Suraj now for closing remarks, and he'll make a statement about the future.
Thank you, everybody. Give it up to Raj and the panel members. Shout out to Boston Study Group, who have really meticulously worked out these details. I would like to shout out to Jesse for organizing this room. The man behind the camera, Pradeep, Rajji, and our brothers at the back. Thank you so much for coming. And finally, our president, Sanjay Bhagat, for organizing the food and managing other logistics. This is great. Before I invite Sanjay Bhagat to offer his thanks, I would just like to offer a thought as we conclude it. I think the nomenclature has become a central topic because we are trying to find out some language, some vocabulary, maybe some adjective to weave us together. And Abdarahman said we have to consider injustice as part of that, oppression, So we have various indicators that could confirm our stability into certain form to lead the struggle. And I think diversity is bedrock, as we have all agreed to it, but also we are forging certain alliances that will bring forward critical dialogues. I mean, Dalit in the Dalit Panther sense, was something which is defined as members of scheduled caste and tribes, but neo-Buddhist, and they are working people, the landless and poor peasants, women, and all those who are being exploited politically, economically, and in the name of religion. So this is not a definition limited to Indian Dalits. This is not limited to a definition. It encompasses, and now, but this was a 1970s definition. Now this has to be revisited and added further on, where we have to add the people belonging to sexual minorities and the people that have not been recognized as equally. So the definition of Dalit could also be expanded. It might not be related to certain forms of Brahmin fetishization, because what we are essentially doing is the Brahmin defined Dalit, and we are trying to find our space within that dominating gaze. If we remove ourselves from that dominance, maybe we'll be able to think independently. I'm agnostic towards working with the liberal institutions who have been the vectors and purveyors of power, because the idea of liberal democracy itself is to suppress the marginalized citizenry. And if we can go back to utilitarian theories and all back and philosophical foundations of modern states, where the dominance is part of state. That's why state is hierarchical. There is the democracy doesn't mean that we romanticize, but still, to effect that, I'm a believer of social justice movements. And if social justice movement could be coordinated collectively, I think there is a dialogue that can be possible. And maybe what we can do, Paul, Abda, and Magda also, is have conferences in various locations. Let's do one in India. Let's do one in Romania, in one part of and let's do in Africa. Let's visit these places. Let's stir this dialogue. Let's bring vibrancy to some of this what has become a moribund conversation within within the social justice structures. The issue that we talked also about education rate. I mean, the Dalits, only 2.24% Dalits graduate every year. 2.4, and that relates to what we are talking. Education is central to this. So the indicators are very palpable. They are connected, and they demand more justification than just putting out the statistical data that we have. And it has to do with larger networks that operate in this form of system. So, for me, caste is a sociological form. It's a definition. It's a society that comes into existence, that operates within the structure that are hierarchicized. Of course, it has the institutions of inheritance. It has institutions of hierarchy. But also, more effectively, it contributes to the stabilization of society. That's how we are presented as caste. So caste doesn't necessarily confine us to India. Of course, caste has been elevated by the anti-caste crusaders. That has not happened in other. So when we talk about race system in America, we are essentially talking about caste racial system. If we go back to the early 20th century and on, the idea of race was not singularly put forward. It was caste race system, because caste was formation, a bedrock of racial society. And that's why when we read today Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, she's not talking about racial system, she's talking about caste racial system. Du Bois talks about color and caste. The whole American South racial system was designed on this very effect of caste system. Reports have been come out in scholarly works, talks about the caste racial segregation. So what is caste here? Caste is not necessarily a phenomena that erupts from Brahminical discourses. When we talk about caste in an African context, caste is present. Early colonial ethnography is essentially talking about caste in Africa. When we do Google research, or when we do scholarly research, we see erudite personalities that are writing about caste, who have theorized the existence of caste epidemic within African society. Enough has not been done after that. When you were saying, Paul, what has happened from 1940s between Du Bois and Ambedkar, the same question arises, what happened to the theories? James Hancock has written extensive work among the caste among the African societies. Of course, it was then sidelined by the local African elites. post-independent, the local African elites clearly ignored, and they went on what their fellow Brahmin friends did, to divulge into post-colonial theory by denigrating the other forms of internal injustices. And that's why the problems I see in Africa, in my reading, is that we have not addressed the question of the African Dalits. The elites have been taking, the Brahmin Africans have taken over the control, for better lack of word. But the internal structures have not been addressed, and same issue we can see happening in India and other parts of society. And for me, that has to do with the essential aspect, the sociological definition of caste. So if you have to talk about the instability of the world, for me, we have to zero in on the question of caste. Because caste is essentially playing its very important role in the society. And so what do we do now? 50 years after, 60 years after? Yes, we will visit about United Nations' lack of acknowledgement towards this, but we need to also inject caste more powerfully. And for that, we need to have comparative maybe studies. Let's try to get together. Let's send our graduate students, or let's sponsor effective studies that could really bridge some of this understanding, and maybe in furtherance. It's not. We have had anthropometric studies where nasal indexes and other forms were tested to prove how lower a black race is. And similarly, the same happened among the caste and African tribes as well. But we haven't had enough anthropological analysis which could really give us this ethnological understanding. And thus, in this regard, I think when we talk about injustices happening in the world, we may have to rethink about the metaphor that liberals have given us. Because essentially, within the liberal framework, the radical framework is the surrogate. So when we talk about the critical race and critical caste theory, we have to develop our own language. We have to develop our own discourses. If we engage and relate and rely on the very, very liberal frameworks that we have, question of human rights, civil rights, political rights, it will mean nothing, because civil political rights in India are the rights for the people who have certain privileges to voice their concerns. Civil rights is not Dalit rights. When we talk about Dalit rights, we never talk about them as being civil rights. We never talk them about being human rights, never a political. It becomes a Dalit rights issue only. And that's where we have to rethink and shake some of the foundations. On that note, I invite our dear president of Boston Study Group to come and conclude this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Suraj, and thank you, everybody. This thing is what a scintillating and stimulating session we had last 2 hours. When Paul came 1 month back, or 1.5 months back to Brandeis University, and just over dinner casually mentioned about having some session in Boston on this issue. I was thinking, or at that time we were just thinking about 1 hour of the session. But it turned out when he managed so many speakers, 3 speakers, we know that 1 hour is not going to be good enough. And we have to convert this into from just monthly lecture series to a half-day conference. And what a conference it turned out. What a knowledge we got. Means when during the lunch break I was talking to many of the attendees here, and they said that there are so many things we came to know first time. That Dalit issues or caste system exist anywhere other than India. This is the first time we came to know. And I think that is the motive of our this Boston study. Right now I am here in Massachusetts for the last 17 years. And in last 17 years, I heard Ambedkar or the caste system hardly 2 or 3 times in 17 years. But since the formation of the Boston Study Group 9 months back, every month we are having some lecture where the Ambedkar caste systems and any issue of the discrimination is being discussed. And this is half-day session is the testimony of that. So with that, since we are short of time and Paul has to leave at 5:30, I will just start with my vote of thanks. Maheji, please come over here. And Abdi, Ajinda, please come here. Jesse, there are some packets taken in that.
So with that note, the first thing I would like to thank Paul Divakar for coming all the way from India to attend this conference. And first thing, giving idea to have this particular session. So I will request Mr. Mahi to facilitate Paul Divakar. Can you open it? Yeah, please. Paul Divakar ji, thank you very much. Magda, we heard you as one of our panelists during our Brandeis University. We put two panels of our own. And at that time also you were very fabulous, and today you are awesome. So thank you very much for attending this one and accepting our invitations to be here. So I will request Rajinder Singh ji to facilitate our Magda. Abdarahman, I heard you and you were my guest since yesterday. And when I saw your last slide and you praised my food, it gave me idea that I can start restaurant. And I think that is I'm going to put that slide as a testimony that I'm such a nice cook. But apart from that, thank you very much for putting such a nice presentations and letting us know what is happening in the other part of the world which we are not aware of. So thank you very much, and I will request Jesse to say. The last one is our moderator. Rajesh Sampath always fascinates me. Means whenever I listen to him, it is like a musical melody. I'm serious. Whenever I listen to Rajesh Sampath, it is such a fascinating thing. The way he articulates, I was telling Paul just the way he articulates the things now. Means it is his music to the ears. So unfortunately we reached him very late, but he was so considerate to accept our invitation and being our moderator. So again, thank you very much, and I will invite Dr. Puljale. Please come over here and facilitate Professor Rajesh. Guest I would like to facilitate. Gideon has come all the way from Washington DC to attend this conference, so I would like to facilitate him also with the proposals first. So Jesse, please for the Gideon.
Do you want to come up here? And I can ask Sanjay sir to facilitate.
For me? Professor John is here from Albany. He has also drove all the way in this snowy season, and when he knows that there is going to be a lot of snow. So he has also come all the way from Albany, and I would like to facilitate him for attending this session. Thank you very much. And last but not least, all the attendees who are here, thank you very much. Without your support and attendance here, this conference would not have been successful. Because of this weather, I was a little bit concerned how that I will have the audience or not. And in fact, when we came in the morning, only 5 of us were there. So that was really concerned. But thank you very much for attending. And there are so many people who has helped do all the logistics, and I don't want to spend the time in letting them know. Swaroop, who has created fabulous flyer. Rajinder Singh for getting us some material.